Yeah, I know. Okay, I hope everyone had a delicious lunch break and feel energized for the afternoon session. We still have those of you that are here for the fifth session on post-communist Russia. It will start in 15 to 20 minutes. We still have the question session from the fourth panel that deals with post-communist Yugoslavia, with the collapse of Yugoslavia, and I will now take questions. Okay, Professor Smoka? Okay, here. You need a microphone, okay? Okay.
I have one question and then a comment. The question is why you cannot have Kosovo an independent state? And why it's not, my impression is that it's going to be independent. And we are talking about 5% of the population, Serbs now, which are left in Kosovo, have all legitimacy in the world to be independent. Now my comment, this is the question, my comment is, once again, yesterday and today, making a distinction between an ethnic factor and other factors. And the ethnic factor is over-exaggerated because there are so many other factors around. I feel quite not comfortable with this because I'm not sure, suppose that the war started because of other factors, but sometimes the ethnic factor is embedded. You cannot simply separate it from the other factors. So I don't know how you make this, how you disentangle the ethnic from other factors. Constitutional, political, elites want power, so they manipulate. There are so many other factors. Now, it doesn't mean if you have no animosity before and people feel that everything is going fine and so, doesn't mean that you don't have an ethnic factor there.
I'll take a couple of more questions and then let the rest. One, and then.
Yeah, thank you for the three papers. It's a bit disjointed, but we try to reconnect. I want to first ask Harris, in your previous book you made an argument, which I use quite extensively, about the connection between nationalism and democracy. That is that in the Eastern European context at least, you argued that nationalism was a necessary fiat to democracy in the transition period. Now, your lecture here contradicts this, where you show that nationalism actually undermines democracy. And I would like an explanation to that, if possible. And then to all the panelists, and going back to Paul James yesterday and what Sami Samoucha said now, I'm also not convinced about the doing away with ethnicity. While obviously these factors are constructed and part of a manifestation of many other forces, the onus is still on the people that do away with ethnicity to explain why is it that ethnicity are the lines that are drawn for conflict and not other factors, not class, not gender, not religion, not ideology. Why is it that people in the Yugoslav context and others choose in the main, not always, to rally behind those lines of identity, the connection to identity, space and power, which is actually ethnicity?
Well, Oren asked my question, but I have the microphone. I'm not giving it up. Richard, this question, I guess, is largely for you, but also for you, perhaps. Every conference I've sat in on this topic begins with the serial whipping of the ancient hatreds theory. And in your case, it was John Major. In someone else's case, it's Tom Friedman. And then the bashing of ethno-nationalists. And, for good reason, I'm convinced of the inadequacies of these explanations, but we know that by now. It begs a question, however, and that is that you pointed to all sorts of data, public opinion polls, intermarriage, mixed cities, about how intermixed Yugoslavia was, and that there was an overarching sense of Yugoslavia. But the question, which is I think what Oren was asking, is if that foundation was so solid, right, how did it fall apart within a relatively short period of time? Roughly 2 years, you said. Within 2 years, it was already unraveling. And one can point to nationalist demagogues and elites who were mobilizing people for this, that, or the other. But that doesn't really explain how it is that they were able to sell that merchandise on the political market so effectively. Even if Bosnia had a constitutional crisis and it then led to ethnic conflict and ethnic tension and polarization, why did that happen so quickly, especially given that there were alternative lines of mobilization? And just finally, there's an alternative explanation that sort of argues that if the state collapses or the state is captured by a particular ethnic group, what you have is, in IR terms, a sort of security dilemma, right, where groups begin to look to themselves and group identities harden because the state and society is turned into a sort of a contentious balance of power system. Would that be an explanation that's compatible with yours, an alternative to yours? What do you think about that?
There's no reason why Kosovo can't be independent except for a Security Council resolution called 1244 that has to be changed. History is littered with American diplomats who thought that they were smarter than Slobodan Milosevic. While the Americans were tinkering with sentences in the Kumanovo military technical agreement that said exactly what the Serb army had to do as it left Kosovo and not do as it left Kosovo, Milosevic was happy. He was happy because the international protectorate in Kosovo was imposed by a Security Council resolution that can only be trumped by a new one. And you have to, it's the only way of changing the status of Kosovo legally. So Kosovo can be independent, but you have to get a new Security Council resolution. No, it's not impossible. It's difficult. And it means that, well, try to make it simple. I recently played the head of the Serbian delegation about a year ago in a simulation of Kosovo final status talks that involved quite a number of people who were deeply involved in the escapade. And I was able to get a very good deal amounting to partition out of the Americans and the Europeans because I controlled the Russian delegation. The Russian delegation stayed with me the whole time.
That's a partition of Kosovo, not of Serbia. Because independence of Kosovo is a partition of Serbia.
No, it's not. That's a misnomer. The partition of Serbia, partition is not really the issue. Ethno-territorial separation is the issue. And this notion that the Kosovo independence partitions Serbia is sort of a nonsense notion. All you're doing when you give Kosovo independence is changing the status of an administrative boundary to an international border, something that's been done repeatedly in the Balkans and elsewhere, and against which there is no prohibition and no inhibition, in fact. The problem is getting a resolution through the Security Council. The Americans have to pay off the Russians, to make a long story short. Will they do it? Well, it depends, because if it sets a precedent for Kurdistan, they probably won't do it. So they have to arrange it so that somehow Kosovo is unique, and that's difficult to do.
Where was it done in the book? For a place that is not a republic?
No, you've changed the status of the republic borders, which didn't used to be international borders, they were administrative borders.
This is not a republic.
This was an administrative border. It was, but the issue is not really partition. This is a loose way that we all use of talking about it. The issue is really ethno-territorial separation. What? That's right. Serbia won't give it up, and as long as they control Moscow's vote, it's a problem. The Serbs claim it's partition. Well, Well, you can brush it aside, but never mind. I mean, I think the issue is really quite a different one. Let me mention one thing about this question. There are people who think that because you put the blame on ethnic nationalism, that somehow that attaches you to the ancient hatreds theory. And I don't believe that for a moment. Ethnic nationalism was instrumentalized. There's absolutely no question about that. It has nothing to do with ancient hatreds. But it's still ethnic nationalism that is at work here.
That's a good thing to go to the second question, or second and third, actually, they are quite similar, and start with Erica.
Okay, can I say, Oren, you said, well, why is it identity that becomes this unifying idea, or why is it ethnic nationalism? Well, to start with, I agree, Sami, I don't think there is that much distinction between ethnic and civic nationalism, because Slovene independence was supposedly a civic nationalism, so the Slovenes claimed, and everybody else had ethnic nationalism. So in that sense, I agree with you. I would, however, like to say that why was it identity, and why ethnicity as this overarching idea of how your interest is declared and identified. One of the reasons is that at the end of the communist era, other interests were not so clear. Not only were the other interests not so clear, people were not so sure who was to represent their interests. These are the populations which were used to only one party identification, which was a communist party. So that in the time of turbulence and insecurity, no other interests were that clear. What was, however, clear was what your ethnic kin was, what your interest then could be, and how could it be defined. So maybe we have to look at how you articulate your interest, and under which condition, which interests. So that's maybe one answer. As for the democracy and democratization nationalism relationship, which I have written so much about, and it's now come to haunt me, thank you, I think that still applies, because it was the democratization of other republics, namely Slovenia and Croatia, which actually followed democratization and nationalism kind of hand in hand. This is not. This is ideologically and historically quite a sound combination. Now, in face of the democratization and nationalization of these other republics, there could only be one reaction. In that sense, the democratization of Serbia was not really an option, because Serbia was seeking a different objective. What has actually happened is that in answer to those democratizing, nationalizing movements, Serbia has actually taken a different kind of reaction to this democratization. But even though I had argued that nationalism had become a kind of necessary condition of post-communist transitions, I have also said that is a transitional period. Long-term nationalism will undermine democracy. So I think I've covered this.
Okay, do I need this? All right, I've never suggested or meant to suggest doing away with ethnicity as a factor, as an explanatory factor. It's more a matter of how much emphasis one places on ethnicity. And as I said, I think it is useful to look at stages of the conflict. The question was asked, if the foundation were so solid. Well, there was, then why did it fall apart in 2 years? It was obviously not solid enough to resist the pressures on it. But I would argue, nevertheless, that it was a thick, not a thin foundation. But I think it's useful to contrast the situation that obtained then to other situations that we know that we would say are, with really just the light of a match, ripe for violent conflict or along sectarian and ethnic lines. That was not the case, I would say, in Yugoslavia. The situation was not ripe for conflict along ethnic lines. It took a period of time. 2 years is actually not a very long period of time to, if you will, both manufacture conditions, but also to exploit the conditions that have been generated. We're talking about the collapse of a state and all the uncertainty that generates. We would never say, we both come from the same city, New York City, we would never say that New York is on the verge of a race war, but it wouldn't be difficult for me to imagine what could transpire in 2 years if you're talking about a very severe economic downturn, the breakup of a country, the arming of minority groups, the broadcasting of propaganda that... Yeah. Well, I think there was greater degree of integration, but I still think that it wasn't enough to prevent the onslaught. I mean, I think that there is actually a lot of resilience in the United States that would help to ensure, even however segregated it may be. I think, but I draw the comparison because I think it would come to as a surprise to many people if 2 years hence there would be race wars on the scale that we've seen, say, in Yugoslavia. And I think that many would look back and say it wasn't just because relations were bad. They would say that a lot of other things had to have happened for it to reach such a serious point.
Okay. We don't have time. I feel we're just beginning actually to explore this issue, and unfortunately we have to vacate. No, we're Moti. Basically, we have a session. So I'm very sorry. I'm sure there are great questions, but sorry. And thank you very much to the three panelists. It was an excellent session. And we can continue over coffee during the break.
Thank you. Thank you for turning.
The Russians are coming. Oh, sorry.
I'm just an undercover agent because I deal with Eastern Europe. So I have not associated with the Russians. I deal more with Yugoslavia than with the Russians.
They want something every time. I just don't think too
Commissar. אז אני אשב אחר כך בצד, גדול יושב ראש. יצחק אתה מתחיל, כן? אתה תתחיל שאני אציג אותך, כן, כן. אולי אנחנו נחליף? מה? אולי נחליף? כן? יצחק? מה דעתך שמשה ראשון, כי הוא מלמד ב4:30? אני חייב ב4:30 ללמד, אז בחצי כבר פשוט. כן? בסדר. רגע, את ה-CV שלך, כן. ה-CV. Excuse me? No. I'm Rafi Vago, he's Itzhak. Yes, but he will be for changing places. He's leaving early, Moshe Gamer, yes. Good afternoon. I am pleased to open the official post-lunch session, and I wonder if you have noticed that we have witnessed a unique historical situation in which the Russians were waiting politely for the East Europeans to finish. Usually it's vice versa in reality. Because of time pressure, we made some changes in the order of our presentations. The first one will be Dr. Moshe Gamer, who will be speaking about ethnicity, nationalism, and Islam and the state, the case of Eastern Caucasus. Moshe Gamer is a senior lecturer at the Department of Middle Eastern and African History at Tel Aviv University. He is the author of, among others, of Muslim resistance to the Tsar, Shamil, and the conquest of Chechnya and Dagestan in 1994, and recently The Lone Wolf and the Bear, 3 centuries of Chechen defiance of Russian rule, published in London in 2005, and dozens of articles on the history and contemporary affairs of the Caucasus, Central Asia, and the Middle East, and of course a very old friend. Please, Moshe.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm sure you all know this old story about a certain John Doe who survived the big flood of the Mississippi, and then, having lost all his property and everything, went on making a living by lecturing to people how he survived the big flood. And then he comes up to heaven, he gets registered, gets his member's card, everything, and then the angel asks him, well, you know, we have all kinds of voluntary activities, cultural activities, what could you contribute? He said, well, I can give a lecture about how I survived the big flood of the Mississippi. And the angel says to him, you know, it's a little bit limited topic. Can you do something more widely? And he said, no, that's the only thing I can do. So he says to him, okay, I mean, go ahead, we'll arrange for you to lecture, but remember that Noah is going to be in the audience. Now, my Noah is sitting here, it's my wife, who's my best friend, my most penetrating critic, and the one who actually made me prepare this presentation. So, as the French say, cherchez la femme, if anything goes wrong, you know. No. Now, the proper name which I gave for my lecture is Ethnicity, Nationalism, Islam, and the state, the case of Russia's Eastern Caucasus. Now, this is the Caucasus. You can see the borderline between Russia and the republics to the south. Here is the Eastern Caucasus. It consists basically of Dagestan, Chechnya, and Ingushetia. And I decided to concentrate on Dagestan. I mean, Chechnya is probably more familiar to people. It has become now a household name. But I think Dagestan is no less interesting and fascinating, and I hope to impress it on you. So, nationalism. Dagestan is one of the autonomous republics of the Russian Federation, previously an autonomous republic within the Soviet Union. What's peculiar in it is that it is owned jointly by 14 nationalities. Dagestan is or shall we say it another way, the native population of Dagestan is divided into more than 30 ethno-linguistic groups, or rather linguistic groups, which were congested by the Soviets into 9 officially recognized nationalities. Here you can see them. The black ones are basically the mountain nationalities. The mountains are actually the historic traditional part of Dagestan. It's the southern part of the country. The red ones are the 2 Turkic peoples of the lowlands, which are now part of Dagestan and officially recognized. And the 3 blue ones down are the 3 nationalities which have their own political structures, but also are recognized as titular nationalities in Dagestan, and these are Russians, Azeris or Azerbaijanis, and Chechens. Now, when the Soviet Union disintegrated, in Dagestan, like in all other parts of the Russian Federation, the previous political elite stayed in power, what is known now in the post-Soviet space as partocratia. The only exception was Chechnya, and that's why Chechnya is also an exception in many other ways. The ruling elite faced the same problem like that one in all other places, and that is the disappearance of the party as a basis for power, and the disappearance of the Marxist-Leninist ideology as legitimation and mobilization, and they had to look for other things. The 2 things which usually were taken up by elites all over the previous Soviet Union were nationalism and religion, usually in a combination of both. Now in Dagestan, as you can see already, nationalism cannot be a unifying factor. And what we have, because we have 14 official nationalities, we have a series of discords and of conflicts. One is the inner versus outer nationalities, that is, nationalities which live or are recognized as home nationalities only in Dagestan, and those who have other, the 3 who have other homelands as well. Another is mountain versus lowland, which you have seen before, the ones in black and the ones in red. It is also, as it comes, that the mountains speak, with the exception of the Tats, which are basically are Jews, all speak Caucasian languages, and the lowland people speak Turkic languages. Small versus big nationalities. Of course, there are grievances by small nationalities that they don't have their share in power, and that the big ones take more. And in particular, also among the big ones, there's the big power struggle between Avars, who form about a quarter of the population, and the Dargins, the second one, who form about 15–17% of the population. And in the present case, the one who used to be the party secretary, then the chairman of the common presidency, and then finally president, is a Dargin. But we have also national conflicts, which are to a great extent the inheritance of Soviet policies. One problem is the problem of divided nationalities. Some of the nationalities in the south are divided between Dagestan, which is now in the Russian Federation, and Azerbaijan or Georgia, which are now independent states. So suddenly, an administrative border, which had no meaning, divides people and hinders their daily lives. People used to shop across the border or to work or whatever, and now they have to get a visa to go to their shopping place, working place, etc. This is a big problem and complicated problem, and of course it involves a potential for international conflict. Another problem, conflict, is what I call the quadruple conflict, which is basically the result of two things. One is the development projects carried out by the Soviet authorities, especially since the 1950s, when marshlands in the lowlands were made agricultural, were reclaimed, and people from the highlands, overpopulated until this very day, were moved, either voluntarily or not, down and settled down. The situation now has become such that the lowlanders, the Kumyks, the Nogais, are in fact nowadays a minority within their own, what they consider homeland territory. And of course, to me as an Israeli, I heard all the time very familiar arguments. Oh yes, of course, now they speak. We worked hard to make the marshes into prosperous land, and now they say, well, they took our land, and vice versa. So this is one problem. And it led to extremist wings of nationalist movements among the lowlanders to actually demand separation from Dagestan, the establishment of a separate autonomous republic within the Russian Federation, or at least a federal Dagestan with divided territories, without any matter what the population really is on that territory. That's what I call locals versus settlers. The other one is Chechens versus settlers. As you know, on 23 February 1944, all Chechens were deported. That's the euphemism, official euphemism, to Central Asia. Also, the Chechens of Dagestan were deported. In their place, people were brought from other places, in this case, mainly people of nationality known as Laks. Their own villages were destroyed. What more important, the terraces in the mountains were destroyed, so they could not go back because they could not engage in agriculture anymore. When the Chechens returned, of course, these people could not be moved, so the Chechens were settled in nearby towns. They did not leave their own demands for their villages, and after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Parliament of Dagestan decided that they were right, and so it was decided to move the Laks to newly established settlements near the capital, near Makhachkala. But this, of course, made the Kumyks jump on their hind feet, because this would even make them a lesser minority in their own territory than before. So, to make things short, it's a big problem which has not been solved until this very day, mainly also because of the lack of funds. Now, the other denominator, religion, is also not a common denominator in Dagestan. Apart from the party background of the elite, which makes them religiophobous, we have the thing that not all nationalities are Sunni Muslims. Russians, of course, are not Muslims at all. The Tats are Jews. The Azeris are Shiis. But the core nationalities of Dagestan, which hold actually power, are Sunnis. But then they are divided among various branches of two Sufi tariqas, the Naqshbandiya and the Qadiriya. What's more, the division among the Sufi branches also goes along ethnic lines, which means that the conflict on either ground becomes automatically both. So this was not an option also for the ruling elite. To this, one has, of course, to add the environment, the post-Soviet environment of Dagestan, which includes an economic crisis, an acute economic crisis, in which actually, officially, there were 60% unemployed. Unofficially, of course, it was much higher. 80% of Dagestan budget is provided by Moscow. We have a weak center in Moscow during the Yeltsin years, which means that Moscow almost did not intervene to support or back the elite in Dagestan. And on top of everything else, the war in Chechnya, which worsened all other conditions and also made Dagestan actually brought it into a semi-isolation, because the railways to Moscow go through Chechnya, and the only way now out was basically either by air or by ship to Astrakhan. Now, despite all these difficulties, the ruling elite managed to keep things together. It managed to do so on its own, without any backing from Moscow, by a very sophisticated game, both of divide and rule, among the different nationalities and Sufi tariqas, and also a game of stick and carrot. They managed actually to co-optate the major elements within the nationalist movements, excluding the extremists, actually pushing them to the corner. And they also managed to collaborate with the Sufi leadership, even though, and may I just, to play on the title of one of Benningsen's books, even though the Sufis were very reluctant to cooperate with the ex-commissars. Now, another major factor in their success is ethnicity. And ethnicity as opposed to nationality. Dagestan traditionally was divided into about 100 communities, what is known in Dagestan as Jama'at. It's an Arab word. Usually translated as village communities. They center around a big village with a few small ones around. They have natural boundaries, and they were actually polities, little polities with full sovereignty, all through history as far as we can go back to the Middle Ages. These communities formed federations among themselves, confederations, stable ones, for a specific reason. But these were the major domino stones of the political game in Dagestan. The Soviets tried to destroy these communities, but to a great extent, these communities survived. Not all of them, but many of them. Now, a big example, and what it means basically, that while we have official nationalities, within these official nationalities there are competing communities. And these rivalries, were used by the elite, and these rivalries also helped to stabilize the situation. An extreme example is when the Russian army in 1999 surrounded the community of Qadar, which was a Wahhabi community which proclaimed an Islamic republic. The neighboring community, who were of the same nationality, brought the Russian soldiers food and water and encouraged them. So, what basically happened is that the elite managed to stay in power, which is of course its first aim, and managed to keep a lead on the problems. It couldn't solve them, but it could more or less delay their outbreak. Now, what actually brought or challenged this was the arrival of the Wahhabis. Wahhabis, in the post-Soviet space, it's the usual name given to what in the West is called fundamentalist Islam, or radical Islam. The Wahhabis are not a common, one camp. They have all kinds of groups and all kinds of, shall we say, ideologies or theologies. What's common to them all basically is that they were either educated abroad. These were young people who were either educated abroad, or educated by people who came from abroad, from the Middle East, or were educated in the Middle East. And they challenge the current political and religious establishment. First of all, they insist on the Shariat, on the Islamic religious law. They claim that the state should be an Islamic one, not a non-believer one, безбожный. They, as I said, challenge the establishment, but they also challenge the religious establishment, the Sufi one, which to the believers has been sanctified, thank you, by 70 years of Soviet persecution. And this immediately led to confrontation. First of all, with the religious establishment. Several Sufi sheikhs and the Mufti of Dagestan, for example, said on several occasions that any believer who kills or is killed by a Wahhabi his place in heaven is assured, which is tantamount to a jihad. More important, the political establishment, after a short period of trying to accommodate the Wahhabis, and the Wahhabis would not. They would not accommodate. They tended to isolate themselves and live separately, started also to harass them, which led to confrontation. Of course, the war in Chechnya led all this to new grounds. And finally, there was the declaration of a Shariat state in 3 villages which form a community, called after the central one of them, the community of Qadr. Here comes in again the state, in this case the Russian state, the center. We should start actually that in a way the Russian state caused this Wahhabi challenge by the war in Chechnya. But apart from that, what we have is, during the Yeltsin period, as I said before, there is no intervention, and when the confrontation between the Dagestani authorities and the Wahhabis reached a peak in 1995, 96, 97, it intervened, okay, but it actually forced the Dagestani authorities to reach a compromise with the Wahhabis. A commission headed by the Minister of Justice of the Russian Federation decided that the Wahhabis were not a danger to the Russian state. Now, this changed under Putin, where a new policy, more active, was Putin, and immediately after, in a way, similar events happened in western Dagestan and led to the invasion by Chechens and others of these areas. The Russians decided to crush the Wahhabis after defeating two offensives by Shamil Basayev and Khattab, his Arab ally, they turned on the community of Qadar, and actually crushed the Wahhabis. So, in a way, now what we have is Russian tight control of Dagestan and of other parts of the Caucasus, tougher policy, less room for local autonomy. Does it mean that stability has finally been achieved? Well, I myself used this before. I mean, since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, everyone says Dagestan is a volcano to erupt. Dagestan is going to be the second Chechnya. So far, it has not. Nowadays, we hear it again, mainly because the president, Magomedov, is becoming old. I mean, biology takes its toll, and there is a struggle is already being waged for his succession. But will this be, will the volcano erupt or not, remains for us to see. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moshe. I have the feeling that the strategic aim of your lecture was to prove to us that the complex problems of former Yugoslavia are peanuts compared to this area that you just presented us. I know that your students will be delighted if you are late to class, although you are a beloved teacher, but we shall not give them that satisfaction, so I would like to have to present your questions to Dr. Moshe Gemer now, so he will be able to walk and go over to his class in time. Yes, please. Professor Kaplan, yes, please.
Just a very quick question of clarification. When you were talking about ethnicity, you discussed the Jamaats underneath that, but I didn't see the ethnic basis for the Jamaats. You said they were village communities.
Yes. Just a footnote, because I have the same question. My question is, sorry to interrupt, but I think that, but I want a clarification. When you spoke about ethnicity on this Jamaat, for me, it looks like more like kinship groups, but I would like to have precisely what you meant.
Just on this, for me, it's just I don't see the difference between ethnicity and religion when you talk about Jamaat and Wahhabis. So, voilà. And also how to oppose what is in the content of nationality in opposition to ethnicity in this case.
Just very short, you didn't have any language data. Do all these people have mutually understand each other?
The question is, has the influence of Wahhabis grown since the crackdown?
That's a good. Yes. Any more questions or remarks? Yes, please, Professor Yan.
What did they brought the Wahhabis in? I mean, what made them, what made the Wahhabis becoming more powerful, more influential? Were they invited or whatever? Because you said that their leadership, the religious leadership, came from the outside, from the Middle East, or I don't know, Saudi or wherever.
Professor Golani, please.
No, it's just the same question. I was talking about the numbers, and the interesting thing is their influence or lack of influence in Central Asia. The Wahhabis, of course, well, we initially expected it actually in Central Asia. And not the Wahhabis from Saudi Arabia, but the Shiites from Iran, and it didn't happen. So I'd like to hear more about that.
Moshe, please, you have to decide if you go to the class or not.
Yes. Well, what I mean by ethnicity definitely is below nationality. Now, the Jama'ats are ethnic groups. They are ethnic groups because they identify themselves as such. when you ask people who they are nowadays, they might say they usually will say I come from this Jamaat, I come from that Jamaat. In the cities, when they emigrate, they usually tend to stick together from the same Jamaat. People who were moved from the mountains down, their villages down in the lowlands are still part of the Jamaat in the mountains. So these are the real ethnic groups. Now the Soviets divided them according to linguistic lines, which again are not necessarily form nationalities, because sometimes you have also bilingual or multilingual Jamaats. I mean, the Jamaat is the basic identity group. Not necessarily. I mean, they're Muslim, yes, but they're all Muslim, yes, but I mean, they fight with each other. It doesn't preclude them from fighting with each other. I mean, and of course, many times the division is also they belong to different branches of Sufi tariqas. Depends. No, they are not tribes because there's no tribal structure because it's an agricultural society. I mean, it's mountain people, but they're agricultural. The Jamaat is defined basically by its territory, but I mean, it has an element of tribalism as well. Now about the Wahhabis. Basically, well, I didn't say they came from abroad. I mean, they were taught. It were young people who either received religious education in Al-Azhar, for example, not necessarily Saudi Arabia or in Turkey, or were taught by teachers who came over from there. Now, what enabled them to base themselves, let's say, in Dagestan, or for that matter in Chechnya, and not in Central Asia, is exactly this point. In Dagestan, there was a vacuum. When you have to play among such many variables, you'll find your space. And the state could not dislodge them. It had, the Republic, they had to go and ask for Moscow's help. And until Moscow did not agree to help, they couldn't dislodge them. The same in Chechnya. In Chechnya, they got power because it was power vacuum there. After the war, I mean, the country was destroyed. They were the only ones who had money, who had weapons, who had a clear vision of the world, and so they were attractive. Now, in this particular case, for example, they were successful in one Jama'at exactly because these people came from this Jama'at, and they were able to take control of the Jama'at, and by the way, by establishing the what they call the Islamic Republic and the rule of the Sharia, they also cleaned up the crime and everything. I mean, when every grass smoker was punished or expelled and things like that, things became very orderly. So they were also popular in that Jama'at. But as you can see, the neighboring Jamaat was against them, and they helped the Russian army.
The last question, please.
Yeah, okay. Islam is approximately 1,500 years old now, right? So when the Christianity was 1,500 years old, the Luther attacked the Catholic Church, trying to make it better. Don't you see some analogy between Wahhabis' attack on the official Islam now and Protestantism? So don't we have a sort of a broader process going on?
Well, I don't know. Maybe yes, but it's dangerous to make an equation, because in Islam, unlike in Christianity, there is no church. There is no establishment. In Sunni, in Shia, yes, in Sunni Islam. I'm talking about Sunni Islam. These are Sunnis. I mean, the established Islam is created by the state, and therefore it was also weak in the Soviet Union as it is usually weak in all other places. Anyone who studied religious studies and got a diploma is an independent lawgiver, law interpreter.
But
Thank you.
Another just a remark about Wahhabi. It's a general term that's used by the state to call everybody who is teaching different schools of Islam, and it's coming from the Sunni schools from Saudi Arabia mostly. Wahhabism was a concrete sect within Islam, but not everything that goes to Central Asia is really Wahhabi. It's Salafi, it's all kinds of schools and teachings that are going there, and the Russian state and Central Asian state call it Wahhabi as a general term.
Thank you very much. In such a case, in Israel, we form a subcommittee to go on with discussing in another room, while we have to proceed with our conference, because our time is running short. Our next speaker is Dr. Itzhak Brudny, who is a senior lecturer in political science and Russian studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He obtained his BA in political science and history from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and his master's degree and PhD in politics from Princeton University. Since 1999 to the present, as I mentioned, he's senior lecturer in political science and Russian studies. Between 1992 and 1998, he was assistant professor of political science at Yale University. And in 2005, or since 2005, he chairs the J. and Leonid Darwin Chair in Soviet and East European Studies at the Hebrew University. Among his publications, co-editor of Restructuring Russia, The Post-Communist Years, New York 2004, Cambridge University Press, and in 1998, published Reinventing Russia, Russian Nationalism and the Soviet State, 1953-1991. His work in progress now is making and unmaking of post-communist Russian democracy, institutions, elites, and identities. He will speak to us now on federalism, democracy, and ethnic conflict, the case of post-communist Russia. Itzhak, please.
No abstract. I sent one. I don't know why it's didn't reach. Was one at least sent on time to organizers. So sorry. Not my fault. Yes, I did. My apologies. What you're going to hear.
Talk to the microphone.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. What you're going to hear, it's a chapter of my book about making and unmaking of Russian democracy. And this chapter could be subtitled Making and Unmaking of Russian Federalism and Democracy. And I would like to start with an example which territorially takes place not far away from where Moshe Gamer started. On January 12, 1997, an elections in northern Caucasian Republic of Kabardino-Balkaria, which is not that far from Dagestan, took place. It was an election of a president. And this is the data from a Central Electoral Commission of the Russian Federation. The incumbent at that time, President Valery Kokov, ran unopposed, which was a violation of Russian federal law and the constitution at the time. And he was re-elected with 99.4% support. The reported turnout was 97.7%. Now, I thought we knew, and that's at the time, that is 1997, when Russia had quite a competitive elections. Just the year before, 6 months before, Russia had the most competitive presidential elections, actually. So we had an example of sort of an enclave of authoritarianism and old Soviet-style authoritarianism. The percentages were absolutely about right, like in the Soviet period, both the results and the turnout. And this was kind of an enclave of authoritarianism, not the only one. I could have brought several more cases. And another example comes from about last week. It's removal of a governor of autonomous regions of Russia, of Donetsk autonomous region and in northern European Russia area bordering on Archangels. The chair of upper house of the Russian parliament demanded removal of a senator, of a representative from the upper house of Russian parliament, from that republic, who happens to be a vodka baron from St. Petersburg, one of the vodka barons in Russia. It could be local, Mr. Mironov, who is a chair of upper house, is from St. Petersburg, could be local things, could be corruption, because now Russia is in a stage of battling corruption, officially campaign. Now, the local parliament refused to remove this local center. The next day, a representative of procuracy, which is a powerful institution in Russia, arrived, arrested the local governor for a corruption case which supposedly happened 5 years ago. And that's what you can see, two cases, in these two cases, one in 1997 and one 2006, you see sort of the pendulum of Russian federalism in many ways. The one sort of local authorities can sort of a weak federal state with a more democratic than regional governors with a lot of local autonomy, and the other case is more familiar from Russian history, demand to centralize where the local officials don't behave as they're expected to behave. The tool of a Russian state cracks down upon. But this is the first case in Russian, in a post-Soviet Russia, where the sitting head of a region is arrested on a very clearly trumped-up charges, since the accusations is from some business deals of 5 years ago. It's almost like a recreation of some Yukos story. So, and that's what sort of you can see this interesting thing. So, in terms of what it tells us about the federalism in Russia, it tells us sort of from the beginning you had a federalism with little democracy on the ground, and then in the Putin years certainly you had the pendulum going the other way into the strong federal state with little federalism to begin with. Now, and when you start thinking about literature about federalism and democracy, you have a problem, because most literature of federalism either comes out of American constitutional debates, which speaks about federalism as good democratic device, which can solve a problem of regional or linguistic or ethnic or religious variety, and good for kind of ethnic accommodation of one point or another. The literature of democratization very rarely speaks about how it comes to federalism, because we have only one successful case of unitary state becoming federal in the process. That's the case of Spain. That's only one. Over other federal states which underwent democratization fell apart. Belgium was a very successful democracy already when it became federal. I'm talking about countries which undergo democratic transition from a unitary situation to non-unitary. The only cases, as I can think about it as now, is Spain. And when n equals 1, political scientists have a problem. So Germany afterwards, another Germany is in other cases, case was created from the scratch. Germany was federal in the 1930s before Nazis came to power. So it was already a federal state under Weimar. And creation of a German state from the beginning, it's a different story of occupation. So one can make a case, but it was already federal since 1918. Now one can talk about the situation of, but Germany has an old federal tradition going back to the Second Reich, and it was federal. Now, one can debate what degree of federalism it was, but it was federal on many levels of federalism. So, kind of if you look about examples, Russia was going, Spain is the only one since the Spain went really without a problem. Now, with all kinds of things were unsolved and they're still being in process of solving. Sometimes on a soccer field, sometimes on other fields, but it was the Spanish transition went smooth. Russian transition was not smooth, and therefore the literature on democracy tells us very little. Insights of Juan Lin says the states which once became federal never go back. Well, Russia is an example when you're going back. It's formally federal, but less formal, less regional. Now, the literature on federalism in Russia also deals with interesting but different kind of problems. They try to look at why federalism failed in Russia. Without looking at the democratic aspects. And here you have many, many theories. One of the famous ones by American scholar Peter Ardishok speaks about failure to develop a unified national party system a la United States, which he claims that holds what holds America together is a big party system which binds all the regions together. So a failure to develop a party system, which is true in Russia, in his case, is a problem of Russian federalism, problem of institutional design, coming out of the rational choice tradition. He thinks that politicians had the moment they could freely design institutions, which is, in case of Russia, is a very debatable point. Now, other scholars look at Russian federalism as kind of a problem of political economy, problem of so-called fiscal federalism, people like Daniel Trisman and others looking at sort of budgetary transfers from the center to the region as something which held Russia together in the crucial Yeltsin years, or people like Steve Solnik look at the interbargaining between the center and the region as kind of an example of what's going on there, success or failure of his bargaining. I propose something different, and looking at sort of, like subtitle of my book, Institutions, Elites, and Identities, a sort of variation on that. I will try to explain the failure of Russian federalism by failure of institutions, or important factors are institutions, the timing when federal institutions are created, that's the second one, and the identities of elites, especially how we view the federalism, to what degree federal idea become legitimate in the eyes of a political elite in a country where the mass politics is far less important than elite politics. So if you look at both these three things, the development of federal institutions, timing of their appearance, and the elite acceptance of legitimacy of federalism, you would get the situation in which, you had originally weak federalism, or at least more robust federalism with some sort of democracy, and then you had less federalism, less democracy. Now, in Russian case, I would not go into all these areas of ethnic conflict, because in Russia, ethnic conflict really limited to one region of Chechnya, where Russian federalism failed completely to alleviate that, and I was thinking about it in 15 to 20 minutes. I really have no time to talk about that, but I'm willing to answer questions about it. Now, if I go back to my regional variables, looking at my time, I would like to talk about institutions as an important factor. Now, Russia was a Russian republic, kind of emerging out of the Soviet Union, was a federal by default. It had a federal in its title. It was a federal by design with a unique case. It was created as a federal state in 1918, when it was actually all Soviet Union before other republics joined. And it's underwent tremendous changes of borders, internal borders between 1918 and 1950s. At the end of that, you had, to those of you who don't know, about 89 units. That was the beginning of post-Soviet period, of which 31 were ethno-federal, ethnic units divided by ethnicity, 21 republics and 10 autonomous oblasts, including a Jewish autonomous oblast, of which Jews constitute less than 1% of the population, and 58 pure territorial units, including the two capital cities, Moscow and St. Petersburg, which have status of a federal regions within Russia. Now, ethno-federal units also happens to have about over 50% of Russian territory, even though the titular nationality of Russia, of this nation, ethnic minorities, consist of less than 15% of the population. So we have these huge territories. Only few of these republics, of 21 republics, have ethnic majorities of the titular nations. In majority of them, Russians actually are either plurality or majority ethnic group. Now, if you look at the time, the federalism in Soviet Union was formal in many ways. The reality was that even though it had federally designed, the main institution of a state, contrary to Yugoslavia, the Communist Party, was not federal. So you can run the state as a unitary state with a sort of a formal federal trappings. And that started to change during the democratization of the late 1980s, early 1990s. With Gorbachev, democratization came what one can call sort of a creeping or spontaneous federalization of the Soviet Union itself, and in Russia in particular, which was mimicking the processes which were going in the Soviet Union as a whole. Now, in 1990, Russian Federation, in June 12, declared itself sovereign. Famous declaration of Russian Parliament, now celebrated at Russia Day. Well, it took about 6 months when all the Russian republics within Russia declared themselves sovereign, even though not in any constitutions of Russia it was written that they had sovereign powers. The federal republics were sovereign, but none of the republics on a sub-union level were federal. Moreover, in this game between Gorbachev and Yeltsin over who would go into control Russia, you had the game of sort of a variation of outbidding, who would be more generous toward the regions and republics, in a famous Yeltsin statement in Kazan in 1990, take as much sovereignty as you can swallow. The expression that haunted Yeltsin to the end of his term, when he tried to explain it, he meant the cultural autonomy and all kinds of stuff. He knew exactly what he was saying. He was trying to outbid Gorbachev on this issue, the way he tried to outbid Gorbachev on Russian taxation. So you had the situation where the struggle between Russian elite or Yeltsin elite in Moscow and Gorbachev elite in Moscow allowed the local elites to assume much more power. And in one elite, in case of Chechnya, even to secede. In fact, it was very interesting. Chechnya secedes in November 1991, not clear from whom. Either succeeds from the Soviet Union, succeeds from Russia. In fact, Chechens negotiating not with Gorbachev, who was still federal president, but negotiate with Yeltsin. It's Rudskoy who is sent there to negotiate with Dudaev. So it's always the issue from whom Chechnya secedes when the Soviet Union still exists is a problem. But in most of the cases, after Chechnya, Yeltsin gets to the sort of accommodation where he understands that the local communist elites, which all anti-Yeltsin, and some of them are very viciously anti-Yeltsin, with the president of Republic of Tatarstan, the most important of ethnic republics, Martin Mershemiyev, is one of the few leaders of the republics who actually openly supports the August 1991 coup. Later on, he would be Yeltsin's good buddy. Never mind. And the deal between local elites and Yeltsin is, you don't secede from Russia, and I would not touch you. And I would allow you to run the show, however undemocratic it could be. And also it helps Yeltsin not to think about it when he is dealing with Hasbulatov in Moscow in 1992, 1993. So you have emergence of these local fiefdoms and local, so it's federalism, it's emergence of federalism, but federalism with a very ugly face, which discredits federalism in the eyes of a lot of Russian liberals. What kind of democracy we're thinking where you have quite authoritarian regimes and sometimes even rogue regimes in some republics of Russia. In fact, Yeltsin even, Tatarstan holds a 1992 referendum, which is called unconstitutional by Russian Constitutional Court, and Yeltsin ignores the Constitutional Court decision. So he allows these kinds of things to happen. Now, after the struggle is over between Yeltsin and Hasbulatov, and White House become a black house and the tanks firing on the parliament, and Yeltsin establishes his so-called Second Republic, now he still needs the republics in a paradoxical way. Even though constitutionally everybody is equal, but some are equals than others, he needs the stability, so he basically arranges sort of a continuous coexistence with the ethnic republic, either through budgetary transfers or tax breaks, or in exchange for mutual arrangements and mutual agreements, because he has, again, this problem with the parliament, which is opposing him at the beginning less, especially since 1995, much more, and he tries to control, and he gives all these deals, sort of short-term deals, and to continue status quo becomes a great deal for continuation of the so-called laissez-faire federalism. One of the major deals was in December 1995, is abolition of elections to the upper house of the Russian parliament, which is modeled on the US Senate, to representatives of each region of Russia with enormous powers, and especially important power of impeachment, which Yeltsin cared about since the Russian parliament twice tried to impeach him, was that now upper house would have ex officio representation of both head of executive and head of legislative branch of each of the units. Now, it gave tremendous power to the presidents and heads of ethnic republic, because now they could impeach him, or they can approve or not approve a budget. And they had the immunity against prosecution, which was very important to them as well, so Russian federal law could not touch them. So in that kind of a deal continue, but what would happen in these kinds of things is completely discrediting federalism in the eyes of Russia. That could happen of a case of Mr. Kokov's election in 1997. With another cases of that type of people who were close to Yeltsin, and he were allowed to do all kinds of things. In 1998 was a famous case of murder in Republic of Kalmykia, a republic on Caspian Sea, a Buddhist republic, where the president of that republic, Mr. Kirsana Lunjimov, also happens to be a chair of a chess federation, still is, as far as I know. The journalist, the opposition journalist, whose newspaper was actually published outside the republic, was murdered clearly on his orders. The investigation, of course, led nowhere. The low-level people were convicted, and again, he needed the Lumzhinov for this or that reason. But what's happened? This kind of us 90s came to an end, and we sort of a laissez-faire federalism, we sort of feeble democracy on a federal level, and a great authoritarianism on a local level, which was combined with very favorable to republics fiscal federal trends, where fiscal budgets of republics and regions were much higher, their share in the federal budget was much higher than other things, was going to a close. The Russian elites came to the dual conclusion, that this federalism is bad. To some degree, to some of them it was simply undemocratic, and others thought that this was simply destroying the Russian state and the unity of the Russian state. This was, if it wasn't Chechnya, but it is as bad as Chechnya. You have sort of a de facto separation, and in figure of Putin symbolized it. Kind of person who said, the desire to bring the state back in, to crash down on all this local expression of authority. And it started in Putin's term, almost right on. And you can see how this pendulum swings back. First of all, eviction of the heads and chief executives of federal units from the upper house of the parliament. That's the first thing Putin does, and one of the first things he does in his federal reform. So basically now, the people who go and represent the regions on the upper house of a parliament, the permanent representatives are not heads of units no more. But Kremlin also put tremendous pressure on appointments of who is actually going to represent the regions. As such, that was one. 5 minutes. Good. The second thing that he did is creation, again, something he doesn't tell you, maybe new, creation of the 7 super region, which was an attempt largely to reconquer the federal power, which in a federal jurisdiction, especially in law enforcement, which regions basically privatized and republics privatized. So if in basically late 1990s, the federal procuracy, Russia doesn't have, contrary to the United States in other cases, Russian law enforcement, it's federal, regardless of where it's based, including the courts. So there basically was an attempt, and a successful one, to bring the state to the federal sort of reconquista of these federal institutions, which were privatized by the regions, and reversal during already the end of the first term of Putin of a trade, of a basically balance of budgetary flows. If a budgetary flows are favored the regions, under Yeltsin about 55 to 45, already on the end of the first Putin term, the other way around. Basically, state took more from the region but gave him back. Not only that, but it was start very hardly trying to nationalize kind of major assets which republics have. The major case, and I think, would attempt to take the Russian major, also Russian major diamond company from the Yakuts, which basically privatized it for their own sake, in attempt to both remove the president of Yakutia who controlled that, which they did successfully, and then take full control of a company which we're still fighting over. It didn't do that. So in that sort of a case, then came complete abolition of change of Russian electoral system, in which lower half of a parliament, half of them were elected in a single member districts. Now it's no longer be possible, so the local officials would not be able to control who is going to be elected in the regions. They tend to be traditionally be representative of their own regions. Now it's going to be all proportional representation, so the Moscow is going to decide who is running in elections with a 7% threshold, which would basically cut most of the parties out of the successful. So what you have now, and you sort of pendulum back, negotiating with elites which are strongest, like Shamir with Tatarstan, sort of negotiating on a very appointment. As you know, in the second Putin term, he cancelled elections to the to the heads of regional legislatures, so now they're appointed by the president and confirmed by the local parliaments. If they don't confirm them, they simply the president of Russian Federation have a right to dissolve the legislation. So what's happened is places like Tatarstan, where he gets basically accommodation with the local elites, which is strong enough and entrenched, so Shaimiev can continue to be in power over, not as he was before. So the legitimacy now, which was popular legitimacy based on local elections, however flawed they were, now would be taken away from the local governors, and they simply now the officials appointed by the president and serving as at his pleasure, to paraphrase American term. So that's sort of, I'm running out of time, and I'll kind of sum it back. So what you have now, you have a federalism by name. It's basically not, it's federal by name, but not federal by content. And this pendulum, some people say, would go back. Some people say, well, Russia is federal only when it's weak, when the elites finally getting. But I was trying to show that this picture is much more complicated. You have to look at the time of emergence of federal institutions and the time and the importance of federalism of a Russian elite. In case of Russian elite, which was very little from the beginning enthusiasm for federalism, especially because of the forms it took, and certainly by end of the 90s, the consolidated Russian political elite at the center no longer believed that federalism mattered. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brudny, for your illuminating this complicated, complex issue. This is just one chapter of your book. Our next speaker and the last one in this panel is Dr. Oded Eran, who in a long career of public and academic activities served as a consul in the Israeli consulate in New York City and the minister counselor with the Embassy of Israel in Washington, D.C. between 1992 and 1997. He had been an adjunct professor of international relations at Columbia and Rutgers universities between 1998 and 2005. He has been teaching at the Lauder School of Government and the Rekanati International School in the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya since 2003. Dr. Eran received his BA and Master's from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and his PhD from Indiana University, Bloomington, Indiana. And among his other achievements, on a personal level, that he was one of my first teachers during my graduate studies about 36 years ago at Tel Aviv University. Oded will speak about Russia and the national states of the near abroad. Oded, please.
Thank you. Can I speak from here?
The microphone works?
Okay, I guess if you don't hear me, please let me know. Like Moshe Gamer before me,
Closer.
like Moshe Gamer before me, I also have the feeling that Noach is in the audience. But in my case, the problem is much more serious because my Noach is not my wife, but it's Rajan Menon, and from whom I learned so much and still learning about the near abroad, particularly what the Russian call the near abroad, and particularly the southern near abroad. So that's the problem. But speaking on the disintegration of the Soviet Union, President Putin labeled that colossal event catastrophe of historical proportions. Thus, one would be inclined to think that Moscow's objective in the post-Soviet regions is to re-establish some form of Russian preponderance. Actually, the question is, what is the specific form and degree of supremacy that Russia is seeking to reconstruct in that geopolitical space, and to what extent this endeavor is successful or has been successful? An interim report. Despite evident discrepancies between various visions about the future relationship between Russia and its newly independent neighbors, Gorbachev's vision, Yeltsin's visions, and others, they were all based on one identical assumption, that political and economic realities would compel all these nations, maybe with the possible exception of the three Baltic republics, to gravitate back to the Russian fold. No one was talking or even imagining the termination of Russian preeminence in the ex-Soviet regions. That would have been too serious a blow to the collective ego of the Russian people. Even Yeltsin and the more liberally oriented leaders figured out that regardless of the explicit formula of interrelationship to be established eventually, Russia would continue to dominate this eco-political conglomerate through the size of its territory, the population, its unmatched military and economic might, as well as through the carefully devised Soviet infrastructure ensuring intrinsic dependency of the 14 republics on Russia. It was clear to all that Russia would inherently remain the central engine running the political, social, and economic dynamics in the area. In this sense, all the reformers, conservatives and liberals as well, were thinking as Russian patriots how best to preserve Russian hegemony in the former Soviet zones after the disappearance of the Soviet Union. Any attempt to draw an analogy between the envisioned Commonwealth of post-Soviet nations and, say, the European Union was and is pathetic. Not just because of the different levels of economic maturity between the latter and the former, but also because of the evident inequality, or as Rajan Menon calls it, the imbalance of power between the constituent parts of the former. One colossus surrounded by 2 or 3 medium-sized nations and several other states which it dwarfs by population or territory or both. Precisely that perspective was on Yeltsin's mind when he, along with Kravchuk, president of Ukraine, and Shushkevich, the acting president of Belarus, decided to establish the Commonwealth of Independent States, the CIS. While the former structure of that organization was designed to appear as a union of a genuinely independent states, e.g., through locating the headquarters in Minsk, in practical terms, it was destined to provide a legal basis for Russian interests in these areas, legitimizing Russian military presence, etc., excluding, of course, the 3 Baltic nations, which, as expected, refused to join. In reality, CIS has become a dysfunctional international organization as it was born with a serious birth defect. The three founding fathers, and later on, of course, the other Republican leaders who joined the CIS, did not see eye to eye regarding the goals of the organization. Unlike Yeltsin, who believed that CIS would become a forum for integration, enabling Russia to set its own agenda amongst the newly independent states, and one should recall that the original idea was to preserve a unified military and security organizations within CIS framework. The other leaders perceived the new arrangement as Putin himself put it just a few months ago, a form of civilized divorce. Thus, the CIS has never lived up to its Russian expectations. It became a loose organization without any compulsory power over its member states and with a rate of 1 of every 8 of its resolutions actually implemented. Moscow does not seem to have been able to control this organization, nor does it seem to have the political will to do so. Having realized that it was left without the necessary international legal basis to pursue its interest in the post-Soviet zones, the Russian government found it imperative to address itself to two key questions. First, defining Russian interests in that space. Second, identifying the most effective, non-controversial ways to pursue them. And these two required outlining Moscow's attitude to foreign influences trespassing into what it regards colloquially as its front and back yards. What emerges from the documents outlining Russia's security, defense, and foreign policy doctrines and pronouncements in the last 10 years is a fairly consistent pattern in which post-Soviet Russia prescribes its goals and conduct toward the newly independent states. The reconstruction of a unified federal state on the model of the USSR is definitely not an operational goal of Russian policies in these zones. It would never be accepted by the international community. It would have meant the return of the Cold War with the West, as well as possibly with China. In other words, reversing the historical course and abolition of the independence of these nations is no longer politically feasible. The practical goal is to enlarge as much as possible Russian leverage over the former Soviet republics to a point that will make their formal sovereignty, officially recognized by Moscow, almost meaningless. Furthermore, maintenance of socio-political stability, particularly in the precarious areas of the southern regions of the former USSR, Central Asia and the Caucasus, which are an arena of Islamic extremism, seem to be paramount. As Paul Goebel once said, Stabilnost über alles, or stability above all. One query is, has Russia given up on the time-honored method of exploiting inter-ethnic strife for the sake of promoting its traditional role as an arbiter or peacekeeper? The Kremlin definitely continues to play regional power politics in the republics for its benefit. Georgia, with its civil wars, is obviously a case in point. The military support of the Abkhazian and South Ossetians, the generous and massive granting of Russian citizenship to tens of thousands of people of this descent. It would be easy to evoke here the good old Roman imperial rule, divide et impera. But let me qualify it and say that Moscow does not need to focus on the divide. The divisions are there to stay put. It needs to focus on the impera. And here political sense requires that no conflict should be allowed to get out of control, threatening the overall stability. Thus, the official thinking is clear and unambiguous. local conflict is serving Russian interests only up to a point. Discussing policies toward the newly independent states, Russian cumulative references to the subject pinpoint three clusters of perceived interest: security, political, and economic. Articulation of the Russian approach to the NIS, newly independent states, started as early as February 1993. That is just 14 months after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Yeltsin suggested that the UN would grant Russia special powers as a guarantor of peace and stability in the former regions of the USSR. Most of the above-mentioned documents came into being already during Yeltsin's days in power. Nonetheless, they were emendated and assumed the shape of a coherent thinking under Putin in a way that is tantamount to a comprehensive doctrine labeled by some scholars the Putin doctrine. The security interest takes precedence over anything else. Like Yeltsin before him, Putin regards local wars, that is, ethnic religious conflicts, in the Russian periphery and beyond, and not a war initiated by a foreign power such as the US, NATO, or China, as the actual most dangerous real threat to Russian national security and territorial integrity. Furthermore, should Russia conclude, in case of a most threatening local war, that it has exhausted all means at her disposal, namely diplomatic contacts, negotiations, as well as conventional military means, Russia reserves to itself, by the doctrine, the option to use a limited nuclear strike. When it comes to the realm of its political interests, the Russian government has prioritized the protection of Russian minorities in the former Soviet zones. Actually, on that issue, Putin has been more rigorous than Yeltsin. In his July 2004 address to the meeting of Russian ambassadors from all over the world, he emphasized that the new abroad and its Russian co-nationals are considered top priority for his foreign policy, coming before the policy toward Europe, the US, Asia and the Pacific, China and India. Obviously, Russian insistence that their brethren in the neighboring republics can remain citizens of their motherland creates a legal basis justifying Moscow's right to interfere in this nation's domestic affairs. Indeed, Putin does not shy away from explicitly emphasizing Russia's full and legitimate right to intervene in these areas for the sake of resolving conflict and maintaining stability, employing all means in her possession. Putin avoids, however, defining practical parameters for intervention, under which circumstances, by what means, etc. Evidently, in the case of the color revolutions in Ukraine and Georgia, faced with intense anti-Russian public sentiment and under the watchful eye of the international community, Russia proved to be incapable of reversing the trend. Thus, the so-called Putin doctrine is by no means equivalent to the Brezhnev doctrine proclaimed in 1969 for Eastern Europe, certainly not in dealing with the western tier of the former Soviet Union. Concomitantly, Putin's precepts claim Russia's prerogative to continue its involvement in the economic infrastructure resting on the national mineral wealth of these zones, which originally had been developed by Moscow in Soviet days. And finally, Russia should invariably be proactive in the near abroad, namely conduct an energetic policy, as passivity and inaction on Russia's part would create a political vacuum and inviting circumstances for other foreign powers. Perhaps most interesting is the way Moscow manages its security interest in the former Soviet regions. As of December last year, Russia keeps in that space 50 military bases, 40,000 troops, and 25,000 civilian technicians. There is an interesting concept sporadically appearing in Russian publications, particularly those of the defense establishment, of the external border as distinguished from the internal borders of Russia. The latter, internal border, signifies the internationally recognized geographical borders of Russia today. The former, external border, mean the good old border of the Soviet Union. The implication is that Russia regards the territorial space stretching between its new borders as of 1992 and the old Soviet border as its security zone. Of course, Russia recognizes that it can no longer impose its military presence on its immediate neighbors without their consent. Thus, Moscow has been seeking legitimacy for its military role in the former Soviet zones from international organizations as well as through bi- and multilateral agreements. Just a few illustrations: the International Peacekeeping Force in Azerbaijan, which is for all practical purposes a Russian force, is sanctioned by the Minsk Group, by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and by the UN. The hub of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the Black Sea Fleet is kept in Sevastopol and governed by a bilateral Russian-Ukrainian agreement that will expire only in 2017. For that arrangement, Russia pays an annual rent of some $93 million, which the Ukrainians nowadays find too little. Russia keeps its strategic installations in Kazakhstan, the Baikonur Space Launch Complex, and nuclear weapon testing facilities under a bilateral agreement with the government of President Nazarbayev, for which it pays an annual rent of $115 million. This arrangement is not up for renewal until 2050. Of course, Russia found that international legitimacy might become a double-edged sword. Under pressure from Georgia, the OSCE, and in accordance with its obligations according to the CFE Treaty, the Conventional Force in Europe Treaty of 1990, Russia was forced to accept the Georgian government demand to withdraw all of its military bases from the nation, from that nation not later than 2008. Moscow is under the same pressure regarding its military deployment in Moldova, but has not yet complied with this demand. Yet, it is within the realm of economic intercourse, more than in any other domain, that Russia managed to preserve in its hands great deal of the Soviet legacy and save it from erosion. The Soviet system was originally devised in a way that would ensure Russian economic preponderance and patronage over the other Union republics. Russia was and still is the main, in some cases the exclusive, energy supplier of many republics, particularly the Western ones. Most of the energy pipelines used by the republics run through Russian territory and are owned by the non-privatized Transneft. Russia is the prime consumer of the entire production of some cardinal sector of some national economies in the former Soviet states. Oranges, tangerines, and wines from Georgia, cotton from Uzbekistan, wheat from Kazakhstan, etc. Rajan Menon has demonstrated to us that the high degree of this nation's economic dependence on Russia, specifically in the southern areas of the former Soviet Union. Hence, in theory, Russia is capable of destabilizing the economies of these client nations at will. Of course, the likelihood that Russia would adopt that course as a permanent strategy is extremely low, as even in the more defiant republics, such as Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and the Baltic countries, political instability resulting from economic strife can serve Moscow only up to a point. Thus, Russia is still selling its natural gas to the republic in need of it, including the Baltic states, much below the price level of the world market. The dependence is mutual, since economic strain in the republics is likely to negatively affect the Russian market as well. What we have been witnessing, however, in recent years, specifically along with the rejuvenation of the Russian economy in consequence of the steep rise of the oil prices in the international market, is a creeping process of Russia and Russian companies taking over segments of the economic infrastructure in the neighboring nations. Gazprom buying gas companies in Lithuania, Russian oil company buying an oil company in Georgia, Russian steel company buying shares in an oil terminal in Estonia. And in 2002, Russia succeeded in persuading Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan to join forces, forming a unified gas cartel of Soviet proportions capable of influencing world gas prices. Thus, Russia is increasingly enlarging its economic leverage over these regions. Maybe, of all issues related to Russian policies toward the post-Soviet areas, the most intriguing is Moscow's attitude toward foreign penetration into them. The loss of these territories confronted Moscow with new circumstances completely unfamiliar to the Soviet Union, possibly since the 1920s. Russia had to acquiesce with the opening up of these lands, which had been absolutely sealed off before any external trespassing for so many years, to foreign intervention and competition. Relations with Russia are no longer the only game in town for the indigenous states. Some scholars chose to entitle the new reality of a struggle, of a struggle for influence, particularly in the southern post-Soviet zone, between several interested nations as the new power game, reminiscent of the struggle for influence between Great Britain and the Russian Empire in the 19th century. None of those actual and potential influences have been perceived by Moscow with so much trepidation as the breakthrough of American-led NATO military forces into the former Soviet territories. Russian helplessness on this front was demonstrated during the decision to incorporate the three Baltic nations into NATO in 2002. A more crucial trial is still awaiting Russia in its endeavor to stop significant NATO deployment in the Baltic states, and even more so when the issue of Ukraine joining NATO, and possibly later Georgia and even Moldova, comes up. That case will be a true test of what remained of Russian leverage in the Western republics. The case is different regarding Central Asia. When he became Russian foreign minister in 1996, Primakov was in a hurry to take action designed to counter that developing threat. The formation of the Shanghai Five in 1996, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in 2001, was intended to establish Russia and China as the leading nations in Central Asia, countering projected American incursions as well as leading the battle against Islamic terror. When faced with a choice between a co-dominion in the area with China or with NATO, Moscow made a clear choice in favor of Beijing. The very fact that Russia found it imperative to make a choice offers further evidence to the Kremlin's realization that no single power can by itself fight terror and impose peace and stability in the southern near abroad, and that a joint international effort was called for here. Thus, Russia became aware of the actuality that it could no longer exclusively dominate the former Soviet regions, and of the necessity to involve other power in the task. That awareness provides us with an insight to Putin's mind when, after 9/11, he decided to change course and support American war effort in Afghanistan by way of opening Russian airspace to NATO overflights, tolerating the construction of American military bases in Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and else. China collaborated in undermining the legal base for NATO's troop deployment in that area. The CSO was living up to Russian as well as Chinese expectations. One should add that in Central Asia, unlike in the Western republics, Russian policy has been handsomely served by the issue of human rights, promoted mildly, I should say, by the Bush administration. A case in point is the president of Uzbekistan, Karimov, who initially embarked on the road of becoming the most important American ally in the region, joining in 1999 the Guam group of republics, which was sponsored by the Western nations with the purpose of helping them to drift away from the Russian grip. However, Karimov believes that human rights cannot interfere with his natural right to butcher his citizens. Thus, after the atrocities which the Tashkent government committed against its citizens in Andijan May last year, killing 700 people, he began to gravitate back to the Russian fold, withdrawing from Guam and ordering U.S. to evacuate its forces from the Hanabad base in his country. Thus, after suffering heavy blows from the color revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine, Russian policy in the former Soviet zone scored an important gain in the southern tier of that space by a rapprochement with the most important nation-state of Central Asia. Karimov's tilt back to the Moscow-oriented group of former Soviet nations illuminates the new Russian modus operandi in that geographical space. Mindful of the serious disabilities of the CIS, and with the recent announcement of Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova of their intention to withdraw from the organization, probably in a bid to join NATO, Russia must be aware of the imminent death of CIS. Indeed, since 2001, and despite declaring otherwise, the Kremlin seems to steadily distance itself from managing its relationship with the other republics through the general level of the CIS and focusing greater attention on cooperation with its neighbors on the bilateral level. Also, Moscow is increasingly distinguishing between its principal allies in that region and those who demonstrate a strong will to drift away. Russia has been considerably successful in hammering out a collective security as well as joint economic system with 6 of these nations, governed by the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the CSTO, or ODKB, the Russian acronym, which runs a rapid intervention force under Russian command deployed in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, and the Eurasian Economic Commonwealth, the EES. Conclusions. Observing Russian accomplishments and political assets in the ex-Soviet zones, one is inclined to conclude that at present, Moscow is out of any momentum and is on the defensive in the republics of the Western tier, including Georgia. It is more inhibited in its action there due to the innate anti-Russian element in the regional identities and to the intense interest of Western Europe and the United States. These 2 factors have had their long-term debilitating effect on the efficiency of Russian policy toward the western tier of the former Soviet Empire. On the other hand, Russia has been impressively successful, mostly in the former southern tier of the empire. Of course, it is too early to write the obituary to Russian influence in the western tier. Russia is by no means out of its political and economic leverage there, but the current tide is evidently not in its favor. What does it augur for the future of Russian relations with Western alliance? American and European experts have argued that since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia has been vacillating between Euro-Atlantic and Eurasian orientations. While American and European gains in the Western republics are to be commended as the cause of democracy and freedom is undoubtedly being served, it should also be kept in mind that an enduring success in effectively pushing Russia from its former Western empire, let alone in incorporating these newly independent states into NATO, is likely to bolster Russian Eurasian identity and sense of exclusion from and distrust of the Western family of nations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Roded Eran. A couple of years ago, while crossing briefly on the border between Moldova and the self-declared Republic of Transnistria, my host told me, look at the situation here, if the Russians are the peacekeepers. As we are quite late with our program, not because of our panel, but because of the spillover from the Yugoslav crisis, I would suggest, and usually I try to be not late to the coffee break whenever I serve as a chairperson, but we are late already. I would suggest to make some very brief questions and comments to Dr. Brudi and Dr. Eran. Yes, please, Professor Samucha.
I've been making a comment about the ethnic factor. So I would like to say now, after listening to this very good lecture for me, because I'm not in this area, I am now convinced that the relations between Russia and the Near East, near abroad, the ethnic factor is very minimal. I'm convinced you can take it even out. So that's one of the lectures where I can see that the ethnic factor is not prominent or dominant factor. The only part of the lecture which has to do with the ethnic factor as a factor in this relationship has to do with the diaspora, with the Russian diaspora, and it seems very minimal in the whole complex relations between Russia and the near abroad. Is this clear? Did I understand correctly your talk?
I would not generalize. I would not generalize and say that the ethnic factor is minimal. It depends where.
Only
in Ukraine or in Kazakhstan. In Kazakhstan, when independent Kazakhstan was founded, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were 40% Kazakhs. Due to the massive immigration of Russians from Kazakhstan back to Russia, we are talking today, according to my figure, about 50% of them Kazakhs are today. But we are still talking. Of course, the Baltic nations is, of course, a different issue. So I would not generalize and say that the ethnic factor is minimal. It depends which republic you're
But the other factors that you analyzed were very important, the security factor, the economic factor, whatever. Only if you say that the Soviet legacy means also ethnic Russian domination. It's a kind of complex, mentality complex, and these people want to dominate, and they cannot get rid of their empire legacy, which is ethnic and so forth. Then it makes, maybe you have the ethnic factor expanded, but you haven't said so.
First of all, the number of Russian nationals in the near abroad is shrinking all the time. Actually, according to my figure, when the Soviet Union collapsed, we were talking about 25 million Russians in the near abroad, half of which in Ukraine, actually. There was a massive emigration from the near abroad, and today the figures are some 19 million Russian co-nationals are in the near abroad. They also, many of them are immigrating, but they are losing their sense of confidence. They were part of the governing nation before. They felt so comfortable. They felt they had a patronizing attitude toward the locals. Patronizing attitude. Not anymore. Not anymore, because they feel surrounded by hostile and national, different hostile and national ethnicities.
Professor Golan, please.
Just very briefly to continue that, it's also, I think the ethnic issues are within these newly independent states. We heard about Central Asia, and certainly in the Caucasus, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and so forth. I don't know that the issue is specifically or has to be Russian in order for there to be ethnic conflict, but it's also that. I just wanted to go in another direction altogether, and that's the fact that since the breakup of the Soviet Union and until today, Moscow perceives its old border, the old Soviet border, as its security border, which means, of course, that the whole issue of Iran is of Russian interest. You already touched on the other thing I wanted to ask about, and that was the U.S. bases, because it was such an anomaly, such a digression to permit them. And as you've said now, Putin is trying to get rid of them. But I would like to hear more about the way in which they're perceiving this. They continue to perceive this border as a security border, whether it's vis-a-vis Afghanistan from Tajikistan or Iran from Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, and so forth.
The Russians are definitely continuing to regard these borders officially as their security border, regardless of the political situation between the Russian border and the old Soviet border, definitely. And as you know, Airborne Division 201 is deployed along the Tajik border with Afghanistan. They continue to act as if this is theirs, regardless of the political situation. And they are trying to convince the nation. Of course, it does not work in the Western republics. So they will have to withdraw from Moldova. They will withdraw from Georgia. But as long as they can maintain them, and they can in some republics, they will. There is no question about it. There has been no change in the last. Particularly, it is very apparent in the publications of the Ministry of Defense. You will see. They continue to think the old Soviet way. Whether they accept it or not is different. Yes.
My question goes to
Okay.
to Professor Brudny. Can you comment? Was Russia democratic under Yeltsin and is becoming less and less democratic under Putin, as we can often read nowadays?
Yeah.
By the time it gets there,
Yeah. Two questions. Professor Brudny, can you comment on the rising xenophobia within Russia, particularly against populations from the Caucasus and Central Asia? Second question to Professor Eran. Is there a way for the West to return to the near-abroad territories and reinsert influence? Are these territories lost for the West?
For the West?
Yes.
No, go for that.
Yeah, with the bases being closed.
Oh, you're talking about Central Asia.
Yeah, this is for Yitzhak. And I guess what I want to try to do is to bring both of these interesting lectures back to some of the themes that we have at the conference, which is really about ethnic and national conflict rather than about Russian foreign policy or about Russian democracy, per se. But the question I have is that when you look at sort of the conditions that lead to ethnic conflict, at least according to what political opportunity theories would lead one to believe, it's both the opening of political opportunity and the closing of political opportunity that would lead to conflict. And what we've seen, as you described in Russia, is a closing, in some ways, of opportunities for minorities. At least through the re-centralization of power. My question is, why hasn't there been as big a reaction as one might have expected to this closing?
Okay.
This is the last question.
Last question. I want to continue. I think it's the third time that Mark and I sort of think on similar lines. I want to continue on that exactly, is to connect the two lectures. First, for Yitzhak, the changes, the structural changes in the institutions that govern Russia, do they have an identity factor in them? I don't think we can treat it as ethnicity in the old way, but nonetheless, is there now a Russian creed in that kind of sense that prevents minorities from having political power by moving to proportional representation and by emptying out the federal system, as you described? And Iran, Samuha said there's no ethnic factor, perhaps looking from Moscow out, but perhaps there is an ethnic factor looking from the republics in, and that is that they want, again, it's new ethnicity, it's new identities that are formed in those spaces that want to prevent Russian influence, and therefore it has to come through the back door, so to speak, through economics and other means.
Okay. Good. Was Russia democratic under Yeltsin and then Putin? Well, if you want to be objective and go by Freedom House, which I actually tried to, Russia was ranked throughout most of the Putin period as free. That's mean unstable. Well, under Yeltsin, sorry, under Yeltsin. Now it's a 6, complete authoritarian regime. Now, so you make the judgment. Now there's a lot of people which didn't call Yeltsin Russia as a democratic. I think it was unstable, weak, but nonetheless democratic regime. Now, was it comparing to democracy in a Western and like in a Baltic states? Maybe not, but it didn't disenfranchise half of its population as has happened in the Baltic states, and they still call themselves democracies. Now, rising xenophobia. Yes, it happens. Even though it's interesting, the attitudes were long there. If you look at the Russian public opinion surveys, at least for the mid-90s, as kind of what ethnic groups you didn't like, people from a sort of a Caucasus, Northern Caucasus and Southern Caucasus were already very high up. Jews were very low, by the way, as on the group. Now, what happens now is sort of a translation, it looks like translations of these attitudes into action. Partly, I think, encouraged by sort of a general, by the state official manipulation of national symbols. Russia created a new national holiday, sort of to replace November 7th, they created November 4th, supposedly Day of Russian Liberation from Poland. Yeah, well, what's happened on that day was a skinheads demonstration in Moscow in an extreme radical right group. So for now and ever, it's entered the Russian popular mind as a sort of day of xenophobia. Now you have emergence of openly of Russian gangs which attack foreigners, especially from the Caucasus and from African countries. Although it's not clear to me that that phenomenon of itself would make Russia differ from many countries in Eastern Europe or from Western Europe. It's simply more visible than it used to be. But feelings are there, and the action is there. Recently, Russian police in St. Petersburg arrested a gang of extreme, sort of a combination of skinheads and nationalists, which police claim responsible for most of the killings of foreigners. Now, Russian police tend to blame, if they find some group, they would blame them for everything they can find. But this may be the case. It's again, on the margins, these groups existed since the early 90s. And what is now, which is more attention is paid to them and were more active than were before. Now, going to issue of Mark, ethnic conflict. You know what? It's interesting. Yes, opportunity is closing. That is obviously true. But what is interesting, it looks like on the surface, it should have led to the more resistance. And I think it will, and it already is. For example, Northern Caucasus, the ethnic tension is spreading. If you look at the sort of, like if you put Chechnya... No, it's not related, but it's related maybe to something else. It's related, for example, one of the places where you have a tremendous amount of sort of violence is these republics which tend to be very authoritarian under Yeltsin, like Kokov's republic, which I mentioned before, Kabardino-Balkaria. So as a result of a certain old authoritarian, so the fact that it was authoritarian and never allowed public never allows the political forces to act in open, now hunting back. Now the groups who were sort of underground and now turned to be Islamic fundamentalists or not, depends on whom you're listening. Now it is, so in that sense, I think it is related because it happens in the most repressive which were under Yeltsin allowed because they were politically loyal. Now, it only remains to be seen how the republics traditionally set the pace of sort of Russian federalism, like Tatarstan, and would behave. Now, until now, you have a sort of elite accommodation. Putin agreed with. Okay. But I think even here, I think it's sort of calm before the storm. I think it's going to backfire on Putin's. Now, finally, Russian creed. Yes, it's emerging. It's very vacuous and sometimes contradictory. It can speak about Russia as a civic nation in order to attack the ethnic republics who speak about ethnic identities, and yet to speak about ethnic Russians to attack so-called discrimination of Russians in the Baltic states and others. It could be anti-Western, pro-Western at the same time. But what's a core of that is, and it looks like emerging, it's still in the process of being defined by the sort of what's the court intellectuals or people that Russia should be a strong state. By strong state meaning it's a central apparatus which civil society is afraid of, and it can punish all those who misbehave. And it's also a sense that ethnic Russians would control key natural resources in the state. And the national minorities had too much representation and too much power. And so that's what you have is a rolling back of some of achievements of the 1990s.
Very brief. A very brief answer.
Just to complete the answer. Okay, I'll give you the answer. I didn't try to describe a frozen situation. The situation has been dynamic over time. There's a difference between Ukraine of Kravchuk and Kuchma's Ukraine and the Yushchenko Ukraine. And the same is with Armenia and with Georgia and with all the other republics. So definitely this is not the end of the game, and we are talking about a very dynamic situation, but the factor that will determine whether a certain territory is lost or not lost for the West will be the domestic politica. What happened domestically in the politics of every particular republic. This would be to my mind. But we can continue talking.
I'd like to thank the participants and the audience for a very successful panel, even though we're running late. We have our reporting break. Thank you very much.
Okay.